Well, I know you'll agree with our next speaker, because her belief is that for the treatment of pain, where do you start? You start with nutrition. And Dr. Heather Tick is actually the first holder of a very prestigious award. It's the Gunlock Endowed Professorship of Integrative Pain Medicine at a great university, the University of Washington. And she has been incorporating integrative medicine into her practice with a focus on healthy self-care and nutrition for 30 years. And she's been on the forefront of teaching. She's been a clinical associate professor at UW in family medicine and anesthesia and pain medicine. She's been involved in a great deal of research at a number of prestigious universities. Had a chance to look over her presentation. I'm sure you're going to find a lot of very useful, wonderful, practical information about helping your patients who have pain with nutrition. So please, a warm welcome for Dr. Heather Tick.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Now, let's hope that these stands aren't too high for you to see me here. I tend to have to look up high. Now, to start with, what I'd like everybody to do, just to make sure we're all awake, we're all present, is I want you all to stand up. And raise your hands, stretch up high, join them together in front, reach way in front of you, shake them, bring them back, do the same thing at the back. Okay, shake your shoulders, say hi. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Have a seat. And I have a question. I like to know who's in the audience when I'm speaking to you, because I think we have quite a multidisciplinary group here. So how many here are MD doctors? Quite a few. How many are DOs? How many are NDs, naturopaths? Do we have any physical therapists, occupational therapists? Massage therapy? Acupuncture? Okay, who else? Who have I missed? Call out if I've missed you. Health coaches, nurses? Okay, great. Well, happy to meet you. One of the most common questions I get asked over my 30-year career is, what kind of a doctor are you? Except usually they say, what kind of a doctor are you? After they hear me speak. So, I like to start with health. And I am a pain doctor. And it all starts with nutrition. Now, I call myself an accidental pain doctor because I really never intended to go into pain medicine when I started. Not that I intended not to, I just didn't have an intention to do that. I was a primary care practitioner to start. But I had known pain from early childhood. And it wasn't any major disease, it wasn't any major condition. So it never took a real form, but I was aware of these episodes through my life and just had to somehow figure out how to deal with them. And the way in which I dealt with them was through what I eat, drink, think, feel, and do. Lifestyle is what I had found for my own coping mechanisms. And then I went to medical school, conventional medical school, and I learned all about all the different medical solutions to everything, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I had an affinity still for things that affected people's lifestyles. And so when I would see chronic pain patients, they tended to be the ones that had the fewest answers out there in the community, in the medical community. that I was part of. So I would refer my chronic pain patients, trying to find solutions to what I thought was wrong with them, and I wouldn't get answers back from the specialists that I was referring to. So I would dig deeper into the literature. And I ended up coming back to the things that had helped me, which is lifestyle. And so that's been my path. And I want to talk to you about not just nutrition in pain medicine as though it's another drug. I agree with Dr. Bongiorno. We can't just treat supplements and nutrients as just another drug, because that's equally a non-holistic approach. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about this wonderful book. This is by Thomas Kuhn, and it's about the structure of scientific revolutions. And I want to paraphrase something for you. It's all about how do you change science. And of course, medical science is what we're trying to change. Now, he's the man who came up with the word paradigms for fixed scientific beliefs that are prevalent. And what he says is that much of the success of science derives from the willingness of scientists to defend the assumption that they know how the world works. If necessary, they will defend it at considerable cost. And certainly we see that in the medical system. Prevailing science often suppresses novel findings that don't fit the paradigm because they are subversive. So I think that's what we are. We are subversive. So I want to talk a little bit about the prevailing culture that we have. And so the prevailing culture, the paradigm right now, still is conventional medicine. So that's why I am going to spend a bit of time on that, because that's an area of medicine, obviously, that I know a lot about. I came from it. But it's also an area that we need to understand if we're to try and change the system. So doctors are well-intentioned. They're rushed. They're buried in electronic paperwork. I don't know if any of you have to deal with these electronic medical records, but they can drive you crazy. We rely on tests, and we focus on getting a diagnosis. Now, none of that's very surprising, right? 54% in primary care suffer from burnout. Physicians, we kill ourselves at twice the rate of other similarly educated professionals. And we are part of the system that is the third leading cause of death in this country. I think those last two features are actually connected. It's gotten to the point that Don Berwick from the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, which is an institute formed outside of Harvard, he says that medical care is a public health hazard. And this has been borne out over the last 30 years. We've had IOM report after IOM report. To Err is Human, the U.S. Healthcare and International Perspective, the report on pain. Am I making noise somehow with the microphone? Or am I okay? Okay, fine. I'm just hearing myself. And these reports have been coming out over 30 years. And yet nothing has significantly changed. We're still doing the same things. We're still as large a cause of morbidity and mortality. Third leading cause of death. So what else do we do? We put a lot of trust in certain things as MDs. The validity of tests. And whether they're applicable to the individual patient that's in front of us. Now, we know that everything is on a bell curve in terms of normal results. And so what does that mean? It means that of necessity, there are certain outliers that are not going to be within the bulk of this curve, this bell curve. And yet, do we take that into account when we see this patient? So another example from the pain world, if you take 150-year-olds who have no back pain, no leg pain, and you MRI their spines, you're going to find herniated discs in about 50% of them. But they have no pain. That herniated disc isn't the cause of anything in them. So what happens when a patient comes into my office and there's an MRI and, oh, there's a herniated disc, but they came in because they have back pain or leg pain? Well, I'm going to impute the cause to what I see on the test. But that only has a 50% chance of being accurate. How often do we do that? How often do we do surgery? How often do we create interventions that then make people worse as a result of a test that isn't valid for that person who's sitting in front of me? And we like to go, we're trendy. Over the years, there have been many trends. We used to prescribe x-rays for acne. Wasn't a very good idea. We used to whip out people's tonsils in the 50s and 60s. I mean, is there any child who survived 50s and 60s with their tonsils intact? Very few. And unfortunately, that trend was actually started in Toronto by a Dr. Brown, who was chief of pediatrics, who my mother, when it was recommended that I have my tonsils removed by the pediatrician, she said, no, we're going to go to the chief of pediatrics. And of course, he was the one who started the whole trend. I am from Toronto. And so we have to be aware that we are into trends and drug solutions. And then we very frequently go to drugs. The vast majority of medical education these days is on pharmacology, and we come up with a lot of drug solutions for the side effects when people get drugs. So instead of recognizing that, hey, maybe I should take them off the drug, we just give them more. We have less trust in the laying on of hands. Now, laying on of hands is the time-honored way in which healers have worked since the beginning of time. And yet, these days, you can have patients who come into a physician's office with a physical complaint, and they will not be touched. We do our physical examination by observation, and I think we're missing something. Micronutrient deficiencies, we learn a lot about them in the public health literature, but we don't really pay attention to them when we're treating our patients. The ability of the body to heal. I didn't learn anything about healing while I was in medical school. From the medical school. I actually developed a bursitis in my first year medical school. It was my right shoulder, so it was very important. Those were still the days that we had to write our notes. We had to carry our actual books. And I had this for about 6 months. It wasn't getting any better. It was getting very, very frustrating. But I happened to be signed up for an acupuncture course. Wasn't part of the schooling, but it was on the side. And I went, and the first day they asked for volunteers for treatment, and of course I put up my left hand because my right hand wasn't going to go very well. That was the one that was injured. And I got treated. And they gave me needles and said, here, do continue this treatment as you go forward through the week, and come back next week and we'll see how you are. Well, I was cured within a week. I had gone to doctors, I'd gone to physical therapy, I had tried nonsteroidals, which fortunately I couldn't take, and nothing had helped. And here within a week, my body had healed. And that really reinforced to me that medical school was not teaching me about healing. And the interconnectedness of all systems. We learn in silos. These days we have more systematic problem-based teaching, but we still go to practice in silos. Now, these three people, Marcia Angel was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine for 20 years. Richard Horton is the current editor of Lancet, and Harvey Markovich is a writer and a blogger for BMJ. These are three of the most prestigious English language journals in medicine. Each of these people says that over 50% of what is in their journals, not everybody else's, their own journals, is not to be trusted. It is either outright fraudulent, it is inaccurate, it is incomplete, and this is the pinnacle, this is the acme of where we get our information from. And yet we simply carry on in the medical profession. I mean, I'm in an academic center. We don't analyze it with that in mind. we still believe what we're reading. Less experience when offering an intervention that might offer better health than renal failure, for example. But if you don't have a concept of healing, then it's hard to have a concept of better health. How good it feels to refocus a conversation. So as a physician, most of my colleagues, we spend our time talking about disease, talking about symptoms, talking about the pain. And we forget the person in front of us. And when you look at the science of neuroplasticity, which means that the brain changes itself, and the way in which it changes itself is that it reinforces the circuits that we repeat over and over again. And so if we're always talking about disease, if we're always telling people that they have something that's chronic and degenerative, because those two words go together, as we all know, what does that do to our concept of our own health? What does that do for the patient? Focusing on health as a positive attribute. I know when I have medical students who come in to work with me, or residents, they start out we know that right through medical school, students lose their compassion, they lose their enthusiasm, they're burned out by the time they're finished medical school, and then it just gets worse through residency. They actually get happy when they come and spend time with me, because not only do they start fixing their own habits, but they see what can happen when you have a positive interaction with a patient, when you get the patient to focus on what's working in their lives or what did once work in their lives. One of my favorite questions to patients is, when they've had something that's gone on for many years, is, when were you last well? And what did that feel like? And they think back into it, and you start to see the person who was, not the patient who's there to give you a litany of complaints. So in our patients and ourselves, what circuits do we want to reinforce? So this is pain medicine data. 46 people per day die from inadvertent opioid overdoses in this country. That means during the time of this talk, 2.5 people are going to die from accidentally taking an overdose of opioids that are prescribed. This is more than the number of people who die from cocaine and heroin overdoses combined. This is more than the number of people who die in car accidents in many states. We have increasing use of drugs. We use different drugs. We use a lot of antidepressants, anticonvulsants, many different concoctions of drugs. And we use a lot of procedures. Certain surgical and outpatient surgical procedures have increased by 300 to 600%. But we don't have any better outcomes. If anything, we have worse outcomes. We have more people on disability, more people in chronic pain. We're missing the boat. And this is a very unfortunate statistic, but the frequency of back surgeries correlates more closely with the numbers of surgeons in an area than it does with the change in back pathology. Now, nobody has been able to say or show or is even suggesting that surgeons are doing this on purpose. However, that is a troubling correlation. So as physicians, as MDs, this is where we spend our time. This is our paradigm. This is what defines it. And we're looking, of course, for a diagnosis. Now, the system of medicine, the system of disease management that we have is based upon diagnosis. Your diagnosis, a pain diagnosis is your entry into my office. You don't get there unless you have that. I need to be able to define and refine that diagnosis of pain so that I can code the visit, so that the insurance will pay for the visit so the patient doesn't have to, so that they're entitled to certain medications and certain lab tests. The whole thing hinges upon a diagnosis. And in the acute setting, somebody walks into the emergency room, they're having chest pain. A diagnosis is crucial. You need an algorithm to come up with a diagnosis quickly. You need an algorithm to come up with a treatment plan quickly, because yes, you're going to disadvantage a few percentages of people, but you need fast action. You need to know what it is. Is this a heart attack, a dissecting aortic aneurysm? Is this heartburn? Is this a panic attack? All those things have different treatments. You're going to save more lives than you harm in an acute setting. But what happens with chronic conditions? So a diagnosis is also a concept. A concept is looking at the broad strokes, not looking at the fine tuning of something. So when I say tree, do you know if I'm thinking of a pine tree, an oak tree, a palm tree, a bonsai tree? Those are all very different things. But tree still describes them all. And that's what happens with a diagnosis as well. So you say fibromyalgia and everybody thinks it's the same. But I have a saying. When you've seen one fibromyalgia, you've seen one fibromyalgia, because they're all different. And with many chronic conditions, that is the case. And it is in those individual characteristics that you have your best opportunity to actually help that individual patient. So medicine is like a game of connect the dots. And each of those dots is one of those lab tests, one of those pieces of the history. And we like to connect them. And the aim, of course, is to get to this diagnosis. But some of the things that we measure are measuring what we can, not necessarily what we want to. So when I do a vitamin B12 level, and I think that, okay, it's a normal vitamin B12 level, what does that actually mean? Does it tell me where the vitamin B12 is other than in the serum and the blood? Does it tell me what the tissue levels are, which is where I need vitamin B12? Does it tell me how vitamin B12 is functioning? Not necessarily. And it is that way with many tests. We're looking at static things, we're looking at a part of a picture. And in all this, where's health? Where are these things? So in this game of connect the dots, there's another question. What about the connectors? Where are they? I'm sorry, I don't have great animation. So I want to use an analogy from physics. Goodness, none of you groaned. So in physics, I loved physics. I wasn't very good at it, and so I actually got a real physicist to give me these figures. When you look at the diameter of an atom, which is described there, and then you look at the diameter of the nucleus of the atom, it's much, much smaller. And the electrons are so small you can totally disregard them. And the bottom line here is that the atom is mostly empty space. So, we look solid. Why is that? The desk in front of us feels solid, but most of the atoms that make us up are empty space. And so it turns out that it's electromagnetic forces that fill up that empty space and make it appear solid. Those forces are so strong that we can walk across a bridge and not fall through empty space. And this isn't just true on the microscopic level, it's also true on the macroscopic level. So when you listen to astronomers, they describe the forces that hold the entire universe together. They're gravitational forces and they're orbital forces. And they cause the creation and the destruction of planets, of stars, of entire solar systems. And it's this, they describe it as a web, as a three-dimensional spider's web that goes all throughout the universe. Those are the connectors. That's the power of connectors. And I maintain that within ourselves, within our health, those connectors are also more important than just the dots that we're able to measure. And these are some of the connectors that I'm most interested in. This is what is going to define the new paradigm of medicine. And of course, how perfectly timed. We started out with a talk this morning on mitochondria, and I certainly love mitochondria, and they're there, of course. Very, very important. And so, when patients come into a chronic pain clinic, we're focused on the pain. And we ask lots of questions about it. And very often, most of my colleagues don't even notice that these people are sick, that these are the types of symptoms they have, that they're tired, they have poor sleep, they have multiple health complaints. And when we look at the acute pain patients, they're starting to have the same problems. Maybe they'll have sleep disturbance. So what do? We give them drugs. Maybe they'll have constipation. We give them drugs. We just keep adding drugs to them, and that actually makes them worse. And we heard in Dr. Bongiorno's talk some of the reasons why that would happen from the perspective of the mitochondria. So many of the drugs we use, the commonly used drugs, are mitochondrial poisons. And so I'm just going to talk about two of those classes of drugs. So non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, every year they kill 16,500 people. Kill 16,500 people. And that's only from the diagnosis of osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. And so people who are taking it for headaches, for tendinitis, for sports injuries, people who pop non-steroidals as though they were Tic Tacs are not even seen in these figures. The death toll is much higher. The morbidity is much higher. And this study was done on 2000 data, year 2000. And what they were able to show is that this was more deaths from the non-steroidals for these diagnoses than in that year for HIV and cervical cancer combined. And if you think that just because you're not having GI symptoms that you're safe, the data proves you wrong. 71% of people will have microscopic damage on endoscopy, even if they have no symptoms. Proton pump inhibitors. Now, a few years back, the FDA put a black box warning on them that they shouldn't be used for longer than 3 months, except under exceptional circumstances. I've been speaking out against nonsteroidals for 15 years or more, and I have to tell you, it actually challenged my self-image to finally realize or see that I was on the same page as the FDA with something. I've given you a reference here for a paper that outlines what some of those risks are and also talks to you about how to get people off of PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, because those are, they're addictive basically, and so your body gets habituated, they're hard to come off of. So bottom line here is, and I'm just using central sensitization as an example, too often we're looking for simple answers to complex problems. So the issue with central sensitization isn't that it's wrong. It's a brilliant concept. The science behind it is brilliant and has shifted paradigms all on its own. But it's incomplete. And so when somebody comes in with chronic pain, whether it's reflex sympathetic dystrophy, now called CRPS, chronic regional pain syndrome, or fibromyalgia, or chronic migraine, we go through a whole paradigm in our mind of, well, maybe they're going to have bowel problems from sensitization, and maybe they're going to have irritable bowel, and maybe they'll have pelvic pain, or they'll have migraines, and this is all connected. And this is a huge nocebo. We're planting these ideas, even when we ask the questions in our patients' minds, that you have a chronic degenerative condition, and this is what you can expect. And there is another way. We can pursue health, and nutrition is the first step, and this is why. You change your body chemistry every time you eat. And I'm finding that's a very compelling statement that I make to all my patients to try and help them understand why I'm talking to them about their diet. Because they increase or decrease inflammation based on every single meal. Now, when your meal looks like this, you are increasing your inflammation for 8 to 12 hours after you eat it. There was a cardiologist in England who suggested that every time somebody goes through a fast food meal restaurant, that they should be offered or asked, do they want a statin with that? So there are people who think that ketchup and fries are two vegetables, as the Reagan administration tried to have ruled when they were in power, so that they could give children French fries and ketchup for lunch, for school lunches, and have that be called two vegetables. And soda, by the way, is not a food group of its own, as some people think. So this is the diet I like to recommend. You can call it the Mediterranean diet. You can call it an anti-inflammatory diet. It's actually very close to a paleo diet if you take the pasta off the plate. It's also pretty close to a vegan diet if you take the little bit of meat that you can find in there off the plate. Though all those diets are very similar, very closely related. We usually think of paleo and vegan as being worlds apart, but they're actually very similar and closer to each other than either of them is to the standard American diet, and the acronym for that is SAD. Now, where did we get to having such a crummy, really dreadful attitude towards food in this country? I mean, so many people are eating fast food and accepting it as food. Well, how did that end up happening? Well, we tend to get our information from the USDA about food and food advice. USDA stands for United States Department of Agriculture. It's a government agency. It's paid for with our tax dollars, right? We count on them. And so in 1992, and then revised in 1996, was this food pyramid. And if you read the books by Marion Nestle and Louise Light, they were two of the nutritionists who worked on this project. And they will tell you that every single recommendation that they made was disregarded. So we have at the base these 11 servings of grains. It says nothing about whether or not they're whole grains or refined. It could be donuts and Twinkies and Wonder Bread. And then you do have some vegetables in there. You have quite a bit of meat, fish, and poultry. And you have dairy as an obligatory group. 2 to 3 servings of dairy per day. And then up at the top you have fats with no mention of healthy fats versus unhealthy fats. Well, it got a little bit better when they came out with My Plate. At least there's more vegetables. Grains are still too big a part of that plate. And it does say at least half the grains should be whole grains. Half the grains should be whole grains? Really? That means the other half could be donuts and Wonder Bread and Twinkies? And then again, you've got dairy there. Why? When you look at the world past infancy, most of the world does not consume milk. They may consume other products like yogurt and cheese, but then there's over half the world that doesn't even do that. So why should dairy be an obligatory part of this plate? So let's try and get some ideas about what the motivation is behind the USDA. Do you know what their vision statement is? Well, that's it. Now, that looks like a business statement to me. I don't see the word health. And frankly, they act very much like a lobbying group for business. Okay, so I want to switch a little bit and give you some background about how nutrition works to influence our health. And so I'm going to go back to 1908 with Elie Metchnikoff. He won the Nobel Prize in that year for cellular immunity. But he was also a scientist who studied and recognized that there was a mass of microorganisms in and around us. And he felt that they were a major determinant of health. And he even predicted fecal transplants back then. Talk about taking a long time to shift a paradigm. So what has a profound effect on the immune system, inflammation, and our mood, but is not a drug? It's 10 times as many cells as us, 200 times as much DNA. Want to shout it out? Microbiome, absolutely. And Elie Metchnikoff named it. He coined that term. It also has 70 to 80% of the immune system lines the gut, very close to the microbiome. 80% of the serotonin is produced in the gut, and the gut has enough neurons to make up a small mammal's brain. We do have gut feelings. And there's wonderful new research that was just presented somewhere in Florida a couple of weeks ago by an Italian group that is treating obesity with deep transcranial deep brain stimulation. And they're finding that they're able to reduce obesity very significantly, but then they're looking for what the mechanisms are. And it turns out that the microbiome in the patients who lose weight is changing. And there's a good animal model for precedent for that. So these two mice here are cloned. The one on the left has a different microbiome in its intestines than the one on the right. And so one is obese and one is the normal size. And if you do a fecal transplant on these mice, they switch body habitus. The fat one gets skinny, the skinny one gets fat. So that's part of the influence of microbiome. And there's also an epigenetic influence. So here the rat this is a mouse rather, this is the agouti mouse model. So the mouse on the left-hand side is orange. She's obese, she's insulin resistant, and she has diabetes. And these mice are cloned as well, so they produce offspring that are genetically identical to themselves generation after generation, and this is a model for studying diabetes. So what they did with this mama on the left is they gave her B vitamins during pregnancy. And what happened is that the offspring she produced after that were like the little brown mouse, her daughter, on the right. And what's even more interesting is that when they went to look at why that was, they found that there were epigenetic changes. There were different genes that were turned on and off in the daughter mouse. And what's even better than this is that if you take that little daughter mouse, when they bred her and did not feed her extra B vitamins, she had little brown, non-diabetic, non-obese babies too. So those epigenetic changes were heritable. So what does that mean for us? That means that we have this population in our country that eats very poorly, that has epigenetic influence on our health in many, many ways, and it's heritable. So we truly are what we eat, what we ingest, digest, and absorb. Okay, so now let's switch a little bit and talk about why we get diseases. So when you look at things that influence the microbiome that might be adversely affecting it, look at these things. These are most of the foods that get consumed. Sugar is in 80% of the processed food that we create here. I have an Italian friend who searches around trying to find prosciutto without sugar in this country and is very distressed because she can't. Processed foods are ubiquitous. We eat a vast amount of those. Aspartame and sucralose in so many of the foods that we have. Antibiotics, they're in our food as well. Pesticides are in our food. So these things are ubiquitous and difficult to get away from. Takes a concerted effort. High glycemic foods make up the majority of the carbohydrates that North Americans eat. High glycemic foods mean that they spike your sugar very quickly. That also increases inflammation. And there I've given you a listing of what some of those foods are. Food is information. And so we have to treat it as such, we have to respect it as such, and recognize that it determines our health. Not only the health of us, but the health of generations to come as well. And so it's extremely important. Sugar, by the way, it binds to dopamine and mu receptors. So that's one of the things that makes it as addictive as the drugs of abuse, but it's also one of the things that makes it really mess with our brains. So chronic diseases make up the bulk of the reasons for causes of death. And it contributes 75% of our healthcare costs. Just think of what we could do if we could improve that situation. We could dramatically lower our healthcare costs, and we could afford the medicine that we actually really do need. So how much of our health outcomes are caused by genetics? I want you to call out answers. How much is caused by genetics? Oh, sorry, too big to hear you. Okay, so if you think it's a 90%, put up your hand. 80? 70? 40. 50? Okay, it's 20 to 30% of our health outcomes are determined by genetics. Now, yes, of course, there are certain genetic diseases that if you get the genes, that's what the disease you have, but that is the minority. Usually, genetics work in a multifactorial way. Most conditions are polygenetic. Lifestyle accounts for 70 to 80% of our health outcomes. That's what we eat, drink, think, feel, and do. This study looked at 23,000 people for 7.8 years. This was done in Europe. They had a control group, and in the treatment group, they didn't treat them, but they were observed. They were looking for 4 behaviors: not smoking, exercising for 3.5 hours a week. It was moderate exercise, just a walk would do for half an hour a day. A healthy diet that looked like the one in the pictures I've shown you, not the fast food diet. And a BMI under 30. So 30 is the cutoff for obesity. This isn't extreme, and what they found was this degree of disease prevention. This is dramatic. There are no drugs that can reproduce this. If this were a drug, everybody would be taking it. Everybody would be prescribing it. But it's not a drug, and so it's been taking us decades to shift the paradigm to allow people to recognize that this is really the path to health. And so I'm giving you some data here on the benefits of low glycemic foods. You'll have those in your slides. And here are the benefits of the alkaline diet. And something I want to point out here, when I talk about all these other chronic diseases, they all go along with pain. That's why I talk about them. My patients are often, wondering, why are you taking a diet history of me? I came in here because I have back pain, and they aren't seeing the connections. And so I do want you to recognize all of these things that I'm talking about today have an impact on pain. So the bottom line, half your plate, this is what I tell my patients, I want half your plate to be vegetables. I want if you're eating grains, they should be whole and unprocessed. And beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, those are a wonderful source of protein. The USDA My Plate still just says protein and doesn't really speak enough about vegetable sources of protein. Animal protein is very acidifying. Our mitochondrial functions, the enzymes do not function as robustly in an acidic environment. If we're more alkaline, we have better health. Lentils in particular are very alkalinizing. Moderate your caffeine intake. No soda, sugar, salt, fat. Be careful of those added to food, and reduce animal protein. It's good for the planet. It's good for our health. So I want to talk a little bit about some nutrient-associated deficiencies that have to do with pain. So let's start with vitamin D, sunshine vitamin. I come from, these days, I come from Seattle. So I could go out onto the top of Mount Rainier any time of year and get a sunburn, but I won't be able to make vitamin D. And actually, everybody in the country, everybody in North America, if you're north of Florida, you cannot make vitamin D for about 8 to 9 months a year. And vitamin D deficiency is associated with increased opioid use and increased length of opioid use, so higher dose and longer duration of use. There's studies on widespread pain, fibromyalgia, and people who have fibromyalgia have usually very profound deficiencies of vitamin D. And this is what I meant when I said giving an intervention that has better health as a side effect rather than renal failure. So if you look at the side effects of vitamin D, it's all good news. Now, when I went to medical school, I had one of our professors was very adamant about how dangerous vitamin D was. In general, they told us you do not supplement vitamin D other than for babies who are being breastfed. But they frightened us. They said terrible things happen with vitamin D. And this one professor actually said, if you prescribe vitamin D for a patient and there's any adverse event, I'm going to go to court and testify against you to have you lose your license. And there was never any data behind that. There were no reasons for that hysteria. Vitamin B12 in back pain has been studied, and in aphthous ulcers. And another wonderful side effect of it, well, we don't know yet. It hasn't been determined in terms of cause and effect, but there's a correlation that's been recognized that people with higher levels of B vitamins, of vitamin B12 in particular, have preservation of brain volume. Now, we know that there's a decline in brain volume with dementia. There also is with pain. So again, we don't know what all of the ins and outs of that are, but there's some new and interesting research on vitamin B12 that really makes it very clear that the simple vitamin B12 testing doesn't really tell us anything. So you can have an isolated hyperhomocystinemia. So homocysteine can be high, but all the B vitamins can be normal. And that is a cause of peripheral neuropathy. So peripheral neuropathy is a very difficult to treat cause for pain. Many types of it are considered idiopathic, which means we don't know why people got it. And this is very new research, came out just last year, and may be accounting for some of those. But we still don't have all the mechanisms clear. There's also new research looking at single nucleotide polymorphisms, slight variations in the genetics around the metabolism of the enzymes that go through the process and the processing of B12. And these may also have an effect on how B12 gets used at a cellular level, which basically means we've got this abundance, it's there, but it's not being used. It's kind of like nutrition in the United States, where we have this abundance of calories and we have the highest levels of obesity in the world, but we have micronutrient deficiencies. People their cells are starving in this level of abundance. That might be happening with B12 too. Magnesium is an absolutely wonderful mineral to supplement people with. It causes muscle relaxation. It's the best treatment there is for cramps. A lot of people like to give for spasm. There are drugs that we use for spasm. But if you look at the scientific literature behind the antispasmodic drugs, they actually don't work. They're just as good as placebo, but magnesium is better. Magnesium actually is a good muscle relaxant. At the same time, it may have an impact on pain directly because there's a site at the NMDA receptor, that's a particular type of receptor for pain, where magnesium can be active. If people have restless legs, give them magnesium, give them omega-3 fish oils, and check out their back, because the vast majority of my patients improve with those interventions. Doesn't mean that there's not some who won't. I have one or two who don't, but I've treated hundreds, thousands with, and it helps. Now, low magnesium is underdiagnosed, and one of the reasons it's underdiagnosed is that the blood test doesn't tell us much. You know that you can be profoundly deficient in calcium and other minerals in your body, but you can still have a normal calcium level. That's because the body needs a particular calcium level in the blood or you die. Same is true of magnesium. So you really can't tell what your magnesium level is in terms of your tissue levels. You could be deficient in many of your tissues and still have a perfectly normal blood level. So I have people take magnesium to bowel tolerance, which means they take as much as they can of a good quality absorbable magnesium until they have a looser than they'd like bowel movement, and then they know that they've saturated their receptor capacity for that day. It has favorable effects on insulin resistance, diabetes, and it also reduces inflammatory markers. Side effects are all wonderful. Bone formation improves collagen, it improves bowel function, and the only adverse effect is diarrhea, which is reversed with stopping. Omega-3 fish oils have been studied for pain, and they do show up in double-blind placebo-controlled studies as being useful. They have an analgesic effect, and there is also an anti-inflammatory effect. So they feed the cytokine pathway, the prostaglandin pathway down the anti-inflammatory side. So antioxidants, my favorite is turmeric. Turmeric is a wonderful pain medication. It's an anti-inflammatory as well as an antioxidant. It is neuroprotective. It's being studied for preservation of cognitive function and even for prevention for cognitive dysfunction. It's being studied in a wide variety of pain settings: perioperative pain, osteoarthritic pain, you name the type of pain, and there are studies out there. They're very robust. It tends to be that over about 3 grams you start to see statistical significance very robustly in these studies. Below that you see a positive trend, but not always robust data. Ginger is a related tuber, and it's also anti-inflammatory, studied for arthritis, studied for dysmenorrhea, as well as other forms of pain, not to mention that it just tastes wonderful. Cinnamon lowers blood sugar, and therefore it also lowers lipids, so it improves the lipid profile. What it does is it clears the blood of sugar by allowing sugar to enter cells without using the insulin receptor. So it is beneficial in insulin resistance. It's an antioxidant for people with impaired fasting glucose. Vitamin C is another antioxidant, and it also helps you build collagen, make neurotransmitters, is essential for mitochondrial function, and it also chelates heavy metals away. Now, we're one of the only mammals. The great apes are the mammals that cannot make our own vitamin C. If you look at what a 4-pound rat does, 4-pound rat makes 12 grams of vitamin C per day, and 10 times that much when it's under stress. Now, it's not a pound-for-pound conversion, but we don't know what the conversion is of what we actually should be taking. But our recommended doses, when you look at the RDAs, are milligrams. So, bottom line is, what do we want? Do we want a healthcare model that is a disease care model, disease management model that we have now? How do we get to whole person care with the business model of medicine that we have right now? Time and attention are the things that are missing from my practice, and I'm in a very privileged position because I do get longer to spend with my patients than most of my colleagues out in private practice. I'm protected. Do you know what the studies show in primary care, how long their face-to-face time is with the practitioner? 7 minutes, absolutely. And how long does the patient get to speak before they are interrupted by their physician? 16 seconds is the average. And these were under observed circumstances. So what's actually happening in the exam room? Now, is this part of the burnout of family physicians? You bet it is. They are so pressured into doing things, coming up with explanations for things that they don't fully understand because they need to get to a fast answer. And sometimes the fastest way to get the patient out of the exam room is to write a prescription. The silver bullet model of medicine, which came into being when, at the beginnings, when the antibiotics were discovered, and suddenly an illness like pneumonia that killed 50% of people, whether they were old or young, suddenly they were living, they were surviving. We started to think from that time onwards that this was going to be magical. We were going to be able to cure everything. We were going to be able to really fix problems. But as we know, the vast majority of things that we deal with don't have that kind of silver bullet solution. And so we need to come up with a different model. We need to recognize that we have to acknowledge healing. We have to tell our patients that they can heal. One of the most shocking things I say to patients, other than having to negotiate with them over vegetables and try and get them to eat more, is when I look at them and I say, yes, you have a chronic illness. You've seen 15 other specialists before you finally landed in my office, but you can actually heal. You can feel 10 years younger 5 years from now than you do right now if you follow the advice to watch what you eat, drink, think, feel, and do. So, H.L. Mencken said that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is simple and neat and wrong. So, this is my key to pain relief in life. Eat real food, move, deal with your stress, absolutely get enough sleep, laugh, love, play, connect, find meaning. One of the saddest things about the patients I see in my office is how disconnected they are from life, from their loved ones. Pain is an isolating condition, and these people lose meaning. And often one of the most important things I do is I say, I know you're feeling crummy. I know you can't go back to work right now, but what gives you meaning? What could you do? Where could you volunteer that would give you meaning? And so far, the most frequent thing that they choose is to go to an animal shelter. And just the comfort of the animals, the non-judgment and the connection is really important to them. So 2 last things I want to leave you with. These are 2 areas of science that are changing the way we think. They're going to change the paradigm. Fascia. Fascia is the major connector. I describe fascia as a 3-dimensional knitted sweater within our body, very much like the spider web that the astronomers describe in the universe. We are, after all, part of the universe. What makes us different? What makes forces not the most important thing for us? It is not just a tissue demarcation. It is a functional tissue. And I'm going to read this because otherwise I'll get it wrong. Mitochondria, which we've just learned a lot about, but OXPHOS defects reduce mitochondrial ATP production and can theoretically give rise to any symptom in any organ or tissue at any age with any mode of inheritance. Talk about complexity. So, I want you to ask, are we looking for answers in the right places? Because you are part of the paradigm shift. Thank you very much.